Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kris. This is episode 299 and I decided to do 299 and 300 on one of my favorite topics, George Washington and Mount Vernon. And this is the women who saved Mount Vernon from George Washington's Mount Vernon. It's a video they have. Tried to do a different one and it got blocked. So we're doing this one. So I'm just going to do the full video and let's enjoy.
George Washington once wrote to a friend that there is no estate in United America more pleasantly situated than this. And Washington was not a man prone to exaggeration. His mansion rests peacefully upon a hill overlooking the mile-wide Potomac River, the centerpiece of a vast 8,000-acre plantation that was home to both the Washington family and some 300 slaves. But even in the 18th century, one could hardly describe Washington's estate as tranquil. In fact, in a letter to his mother, George Washington once wrote that Mount Vernon often resembled a well-resorted tavern, with famous friends and total strangers alike appearing on his doorstep with remarkable frequency. The most sought-after aspect of any visit to Mount Vernon was the opportunity to spend quality time with Washington himself, a figure of heroic proportions. Today, of course, it comes as no surprise that Mount Vernon
What a great view.
continues to be a beacon for Americans searching for the essence of George Washington.
I love going
It is
there.
estimated that some 80 million people have climbed these stairs, grabbing hold of the same walnut banister that Washington himself gripped so many times during his 45 years of ownership. For as long as anyone can remember, Mount Vernon has held the title of America's most popular historic house. As one foreign diplomat commented, Washington's home is the heart of America. But a century and a half ago, this heart almost stopped beating. The beginning of our story coincides with the end of George Washington's. Working outside on a blustery winter's day, Washington contracted what seemed at first to be a simple sore throat. When Washington died the following day, on December 14, 1799, the entire nation went into mourning, and the fate of his beloved Mount Vernon changed forever.
His house had become so closely identified with him already at that time that even though he was gone, folks wanted to come and see where he had lived. And of course that was really the beginning of Mount Vernon as we know it today, as a shrine for visitors to come. And at that time period, it was typical for folks to try to take a little bit away with them, and pieces of the house literally started going away with them.
If you visit today, this little porch no longer exists. I think it collapsed in the late 1800s, or it just wasn't feasible to stay. I think that's the balcony, I think, of Washington's bedroom. But I mean, the whole thing fell into disrepair. You saw earlier they had, I think, in between these they had like ship masts that were up there holding it just so the whole portico top wouldn't fall down. Is that what you call a portico top?
It came as little surprise when Washington's great-grandnephew, John Augustine Washington III, was approached by speculators who hoped to develop the property commercially. Washington let it be known that he had been offered the tremendous sum of $300,000. Yet he could not consent to sell Mount Vernon without an absolute assurance that it would be protected for future generations. John Washington decided to approach Congress, suggesting that the government purchase the mansion and the 200 surrounding acres for $200,000.
Quick story. Property of the nation, George Washington's tomb, Mount Vernon, in the memory of the first president. Fantastic book if you want to get into all the things that happened leading up to the sale and how the government wanted to take Washington's body, put it in the Capitol, and it got to the point where the state of Virginia said if the federal government tried, they would have to fight the state, go to war. Slaves, people used to get on boats and they'd come off to where you can get off at the dock, and they would just start walking the property, and that guy would be in the house eating or whatever, and people just come up and, hey bud, can we come in? They felt like Washington was their family, so they wanted to tour the home. He'd long been gone by then. And slaves used to take people on tour. He started having slaves take people on tours of the property and charge them $5, and then it was charge them $5, I'll take $4, you take $1. Well, the slaves got really smart, started taking people around, and they would rip off tree limbs near the tomb, and they'd be talking to people, and they may not have even known him. They may be too young to have been around when he was alive. They would retell stories like they were there. They would then say, hey, look, you seem like a nice person. Before you leave, how would you like this? And they would take these tree branches and they'd whittle them down into canes. Really nice, sturdy canes. And they were like, the general, because he wasn't the president, he was the general. They would say the general, this was his favorite cane. He gave it to me, or worked its way to me. And you seem like a good person who really would value this more than I would. So, $15, it's yours. People would snatch it up. Meanwhile, you got slaves around the corner just whittling these things down, selling them. Then this guy found out, and he got 250 acres of forest, chopped down trees and started whittling out all kinds of canes. And he was telling the slaves, sell my cane for $10. And they were like, okay. So they would push his cane for $10. But they wouldn't actually sell it for $10. They'd push it for $20. And then, of course, maybe he would say, for $10, you'll take 6 and you take 4, I'll take 6. Well, they'd sell it for $20. So they'd take that 4 plus the 10 and give him the 6. He didn't know that they sold it for more. Or they would undercut it, sell their own for like $10, or sell, and then mark his up, and then just make the difference. Yeah, it was a kind of crazy time, but you could understand why they did it. They were trying to make money off of the whole thing as well. Sorry.
But his timing was unfortunate. Congressmen were already drawing the battle lines for the Civil War, and Washington's estate was located precariously between the nation's capital and Richmond. When John Washington took his appeal to the legislature of the Commonwealth of Virginia, his appeal wasn't really denied. It was almost ignored. And so it was, on a moonlit evening in 1853, when a steamer traveled down the Potomac River en route from Philadelphia to the Carolinas. In tribute to Washington, the captain sounded the horn as Mount Vernon came into sight. Among the passengers was a South Carolina...
Side note, just thinking of this site, if you ever, around 4th of July, they have a firework display at Mount Vernon. Now, you don't have to go to Mount Vernon to see it. You can. But it's online. And they have the camera set up, and they'll have red, white, and blue lights in the front of the house, and you can see the firework display. It's never long. It's maybe a 10-minute video. But it's always just really cool to see firework displays going off over Mount Vernon. They have crowds that are there sitting on the backyard, back lawn. It's really cool time, cool sight. I want to go to it.
Louisa Dalton Bird Cunningham, who found it hard to believe that the home of Washington was in such dire condition.
There were old masts of ships holding up the piazza, weeds growing everywhere, and I think she was distraught. And she wrote a letter to her daughter, Anne Pamela Cunningham. So Anne Pamela, when she got the letter, decided to spend the rest of her life and try to save George Washington's home.
Thank
Miss
you.
Cunningham decided to write a bold letter to the editor of the Charleston Mercury. Although the language she used was flamboyant, the argument came through loud and clear. If the men of America were going to allow the home and burial place of George Washington to go to ruin, it was time for the patriotic women of America to come together to rescue Mount Vernon. As more and more newspapers published her appeals, Miss Cunningham found herself a most unlikely celebrity. In an age when philanthropy was seldom organized, Miss Cunningham specified that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association would include a vice regent from every state in the Union. She declared that every citizen, irrespective of age or sex, by the subscription of $1, can become one of the purchasers of Mount Vernon. States began to compete with each other. Leaders from all walks of life became subscribers.
Well, the one person very significant in her beginning efforts was a man named Edward Everett. He had a very illustrious career. He was the minister to Great Britain, he was the president of Harvard, and he gave a speech about Washington. And he gave the speech 129 times all over the country to raise money. And he indeed raised, I think, something in the vicinity of $60,000, which was a significant amount toward the final amount of $200,000, which the ladies had to finish raising.
After working so long and hard to reach this goal, Miss Cunningham hit what appeared to be an insurmountable obstacle. John Augustine Washington absolutely refused to sell Mount Vernon to women. With the help of Washington's wife Eleanor, Miss Cunningham's powers of persuasion won the day, and the sale was finally completed. In early 1860, she moved into the mansion to oversee an even greater challenge, the repair and restoration of perhaps the most important fixer-upper in American history. Fortunately, John Washington did leave behind a handful of items which would form the beginnings of the Mount Vernon collection. The key to the Bastille, presented to Washington by the Marquis de Lafayette. The terrestrial globe, featuring the travels of Captain Cook. And the original terracotta sculpture of Washington, fashioned by the famous French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon. One of Miss Cunningham's first and most...
You're not going to be able to read it. But it's Bust George Washington by Jean... Exactly as she said it. Done in 1784. In 1784, this guy was chosen by Thomas Jefferson to make a statue of George Washington for the state capitol in Richmond, Virginia. In case you didn't, this is the small scale, as it says.
Important decisions was to protect much more than the mansion. Many of her closest advisors, realizing that slavery was a topic that divided the nation, urged her to tear down the simple structures surrounding the mansion, where many of the slaves lived and worked. Instead, she decided that everything that was part of Washington's estate deserved to be preserved, from the crumbling mortar of the cistern to the decaying timbers of the spinning house. Over time, this inclusive approach to historic places would evolve into the guiding principle of our national preservation movement. Just as Miss Cunningham was beginning to organize the long list of preservation projects, the dark days of the Civil War engulfed the nation, and she was forced to return to her South Carolina plantation. For the next 6 years, her secretary, Sarah Tracy, and Mount Vernon Superintendent Upton Herbert stood sentry.
During the war, we know that both Confederate and Union troops came to Mount Vernon. Sarah Tracy had gotten a pledge from General Winfield Scott for the Union and from the governor of Virginia that no armed troops would come to Mount Vernon. But that didn't mean that the troops didn't come here anyway, just to visit. And we know that troops from both sides came here quite often. There are even some carvings and some trees here at Mount Vernon, a star and a cross, and the lore here is that those date from the Civil War period and were mementos that were carved into the trees by soldiers.
If you visit the tomb, take a look at the brick, mostly on the left side of the entrance of the tomb, and really take a look at it. And you can see where people scribed initials and the year. I have a picture. Yeah, I showed it on a previous thing, like something about history lessons or something like that on my channel a long time ago. And I show some of those pictures, and I think one of them was like AC 1861 or something, or 1862, something like that. It's really cool. There's a lot of just, that one was a really good one, you know, in terms of engraving. Somebody just really dug into that brick. It's really cool.
As the nation entered a period of rebirth and recovery, Anne Pamela Cunningham returned to Mount Vernon with renewed enthusiasm. Fortunately, like George Washington, Miss Cunningham had a knack for picking talented and dynamic people to assist her. The vice-regents she selected were women who broke the mold of the strict confines of Victorian society, and her very first choice was no exception: Anna Ogden Ritchie of Richmond, Virginia.
She had rather astute vision at the time of gathering the women. The first person she asked was a woman from Virginia who was an actress. And in those days, of course, that was rather an unusual thing for an aristocratic lady to be doing.
To serve as the first vice-regent for New York, Miss Cunningham selected the granddaughter of Alexander Hamilton. The first Florida vice-regent, Catherine Dangerfield Willis Gray, became a full-fledged princess by virtue of her marriage to the son of Napoleon's cavalry commander. This group of fascinating women possessed important contacts in virtually every state. Members of the Washington and Augustus families donated a number of original pieces to the mansion, including the Nellie Custis harpsichord and the oversized bed Mrs. Washington ordered to accommodate her husband's frame of almost 6'3". Several rooms in the mansion were established as museum spaces, with exhibit cases full of artifacts and memorabilia. Many of the rooms in the mansion were adopted by individual vice-regents, who returned to their home states to gather an assortment of antiques and other furnishings, which would serve as placeholders until the original Washington items could be located and hopefully accessioned through gifts, loans, or outright purchase. For instance, visitors to Mount Vernon in the early 20th century would see an Empire sofa in the parlor, which, although stylish, wasn't crafted until 30 years after Washington's death. Help in restoring the estate to its original appearance also came from the descendants of first-hand witnesses. A number of African Americans who were freed by Washington in his will, and others who had gained freedom during the Civil War, remained on or near the Mount Vernon estate, often working as gardeners and guards. Vital information about Washington's outbuildings, gardens, and grounds was passed down from one generation to the next.
It's always been known that enslaved people were the master builders of these plantation homes, and Mount Vernon is no exception. There was a lot of pride taken in the skills that you might have seen demonstrated here. You build something, it belongs in part to you. You sew a dress, it in part is your dress as well, even though you are not wearing it. So I think that those might have been the reasons that they came back to take care of it.
As the regent and vice-regents began to recognize the toll that thousands of visitors can take on a structure, the best and brightest experts came to their aid.
At Mount Vernon, we've had such support from wonderful business leaders, philanthropists. Henry Ford being one, he gave the first fire truck to be here on the estate. Thomas Edison actually wired the mansion, and the next generations of all of those people have been very supportive to the current times.
The controversial railroad executive Jay Gould provided the funds to expand the property by some 33 acres. The first vice-regent for California, Mrs. Phoebe Apperson Hearst, donated funds to construct a stone seawall to prevent the rapid erosion of Washington's hillside.
Interesting.
She also financed the construction of a wharf, which 90 years later was refurbished by the regent of the association, Mabel Bishop, who raised gifts from throughout her state of Oregon. In a similar fashion, Texans built and then restored the entry gate, and Washington lovers in Massachusetts rescued a disintegrating cupola just in time. In addressing each preservation challenge, the association depended upon incredibly detailed research into the papers and books of George Washington, which began to shed light on how he furnished each room in the mansion. Original Washington objects were returned to their rightful places, and exhibit cases were transferred to a small museum. Piece by piece, room by room, the association's quest for authenticity was becoming a reality. And then, with a single controversial decision, the regent and vice-regents once again demonstrated bold leadership in the preservation movement.
When we undertook paint analysis in the 1970s and 1980s through the help of Matt Mosca, it really transformed what we knew about George Washington, Martha Washington, and the interior spaces of Mount Vernon. A lot of people were in disbelief that Washington, the father of the country and presumably a man of exquisite taste, was living with what they considered to be rather garish colors.
The paint research at Mount Vernon, detailed and uncompromising, inspired the stewards of other historic homes to take similar steps toward greater authenticity. As preservation technology has become more and more sophisticated, the association has been able to restore aspects of the estate that Anne Pamela Cunningham and the original vice-regents hardly knew existed. Using evidence garnered from detailed archaeological excavations, experts have been able to recreate Washington's exquisite gardens and to reconstruct the dung repository, thought to be the first structure in America devoted exclusively to composting. Washington's most remarkable invention, a 16-sided treading barn which revolutionized the processing of wheat, has been recreated through the generosity of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. With costumed workers, a large animal population, and ever-changing crops, the Pioneer Farm has quickly become one of the most popular stops on a Mount Vernon tour. And 2 miles...
Whenever I go and I try to go down to that barn, there's always geese all over the place. And I always feel like, I mean, they'll move out of the way, but I always feel like I'm going to be mauled to death by geese.
Away, on its original site, a replica of Washington's grist mill, one of the most advanced machines of its day, transforms threshed wheat into the finest flour. Just a few feet away, archaeologists are uncovering the remains of Washington's Distillery, one of the largest in 18th century America.
You know, as beautiful as the mansion is, and as authentic as the grounds are, if there's one aha moment at Mount Vernon, it's when people come out of the dining room onto the piazza and see the sensational view across the Potomac River. And I think it's amazing that just a few decades ago, we were about to lose all of that. There was a threat of not only an oil tank refinery, but also a sewage treatment plant. Can you imagine two more damaging things to that pristine view? And fortunately, we had an insider that really helped us to save that view. We had someone on our board who was also a very important congresswoman, and that would be Frances Payne Bolton.
Using her own funds, Ohio Congresswoman Bolton quickly purchased enough acreage to slow down the developments, and then led a full-fledged lobbying effort to persuade Congress to take defensive action. In 1974, President Gerald Ford signed into law the bill which provided the funding to create Piscataway National Park, protecting the immediate shoreline. And in the years since, Mount Vernon has worked with the National Park Service, the Accokeek Foundation, the Trust for Public Land, and Maryland neighbors to protect additional acreage. Vigilance is still called for, however, because the far ridge of forests, as seen from Mount Vernon's east lawn, remains unprotected. Although the Mount Vernon Ladies Association works hand in glove with several government agencies on a variety of issues, the regent and vice-regents maintain a strong sense of independence.
One of the things we've been able to do as the Mount Vernon Ladies Association is always keep it in private hands. All the money for the past 150 years, all of it that has gone into the restoration and maintenance of the grounds of the estate has come from private people, private enterprise, and individuals, Americans. I think that's a really important fact.
And in recent years, the association's mission has been expanded to embrace a new and urgent challenge. American history in general, and George Washington in particular, are being short-shrifted in classrooms throughout the nation. Future plans call for the construction of a new education center and museum, and the creation of the association's first orientation film.
When I was growing up, there was a portrait of George Washington in every post office in America and practically every classroom, and that's all disappeared. And so as the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, we want to establish here at Mount Vernon a library that will go on to educate forever all of the visitors, not just the children and our grandchildren, but all of the visitors of Mount Vernon, of perhaps the greatest founding father of all, because without him, we simply wouldn't be America.
Today, more than 1 million people a year arrive on Washington's doorstep, eager to see where the great man lived and worked. Most of the men who have tried to follow in Washington's formidable footsteps as president have made their own pilgrimage to Mount Vernon, as have many world leaders.
Lots of famous people have come. Queen Elizabeth came when she was just a princess, and apparently when she saw the mansion, she called it a cozy little cottage, which was rather interesting, we thought.
Other foreign dignitaries may have been more diplomatic, but their first impressions were quite the same. Mount Vernon is decidedly simple when compared to the palaces of European leaders.
Yeah.
And yet there is a common acceptance and an unmistakable sense of pride that this is as it should be. Mount Vernon is a reflection of both a new type of leader and a new kind of nation.
Well, George Washington is truly America's indispensable man. I mean, he's the essential man in a fair understanding of American history. And not only an essential man in the sense of winning the war for independence, but I believe George Washington's an essential man in the writing and ratifying of the Constitution. He's the essential man in keeping the United States at peace and unified during its early critical years. Without his skill, without his charisma, without his ability as a unifier, I really do not think it is an exaggeration to say we would not be a single United States of America.
Perhaps that's why Mount Vernon's most important audience is not royal visitors from faraway climes or our own leaders from just 16 miles away on Capitol Hill. As it celebrates its 150th anniversary, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association is determined, more than ever, to introduce each new generation of children to the most respected and admired leader in American history. Because among those children are our leaders of tomorrow, who will be called upon to safeguard the freedom and the liberty George Washington worked so hard to obtain.
Thank you, Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Well, I don't know how many of you will have watched this that aren't American, but if you did, thank you. I think it's great. I appreciate all the support. I think this will be $2.99, I said. So $300 will probably be another Washington, because it's my party and I'll cry if I want to. However that song goes. So, Thanks for the support. Like and subscribe. Puppies on spikes. And have a good day. Have a good night.